weapons are designed to kill a lot of people in a very short period of time. And I'm announcing it for the first time today here with you, to take executive action to ban the import of assault weapons into our country.
So how does she exactly define an assault weapon, quote-unquote assault weapon? She wants to ban semi-automatics from the inside, and she apparently wants to ban semi-automatics from the outside, and yet at the exact same time, she is somehow promoting herself as being pro-Second Amendment, a gun-toting pro-Second Amendment candidate, while trying to choke off every bit of breath that the Second Amendment still has here in the U.S. Now, how is it that we have people running in the disarmament primary who want to be commander-in-chief of this country, yet openly admit to the world that they will unapologetically overstep their bounds as the chief executive and wipe out rights? That does not sound like the words of someone who is a gun-toting pro-Second Amendment candidate. Those more so sound like the words of a tyrant. For a group of candidates that are so tied to the ideology of both gun control and identity politics, disarmament Democrats are soon going to have to pick a side. According to an article published by John Lott of the Crime Prevention Research Center, the rules and regulations that candidates like Cory Booker and Kamala Harris would affect gun owners as a whole, but they would also hit minority communities the hardest. They'd hit women the hardest. They'd hit the gay community the hardest. So you can either fight for the rights of minorities or continue to on this never-ending path of gun control. With me now to discuss this paradox, the president of the Crime Prevention Research Center, John Lott. John, good to see you. You've written a lot about this, particularly all of the different groups within the American demographic as a whole that would be disproportionately affected by rules, regulations, such as the like that Kamala Harris and others propose, particularly the black community. Talk to us a little bit about this.
Sure. Well, I mean, on the one hand, you have Democrats saying that free voter IDs impose an undue burden and will discriminate against poor minorities. On the other hand, you have Kamala Harris and Cory Booker in the last week or so have come out for requiring licenses for you to be able to go and get guns. And New Jersey, Cory Booker's home state, the governor there wants to increase the cost of a license of a firearm ID there to $100 and $50 for a permit for each gun that you would own. You know, $150, $200 to be able to go and own a gun or two guns. You wonder who they think that they're going to be disarming. All the candidates have come out in favor of universal background checks. These background checks aren't free to the people who are buying them. In Washington, D.C., where they're going to be voting on this, it costs $125 to transfer each gun just to do the background check on it. And just to give you an idea of how these are set up, in case people don't know, the background check is done separately on each gun. So if I were to go and, let's say, sell you 4 guns, even though I'm selling it just to you, one person, I'd have to have 4 separate background checks done. So rather than $125, you're talking about $500 that would have to be paid. You look at those types of things and you figure, well, it seems pretty clear they're just trying to make it costly. But the thing is, if they believe that free voter IDs are going to discriminate against poor minorities being able to go and vote, what do they think happens when they go and impose fees for licenses, fees for these background checks? Makes a real impact. I mean, I could go through lots of things. I'll give you just one final example before we go on, and that is, I can give you like 30 of these cases, but a few years ago when Colorado was passing its background checks on private transfers, I got calls from some people in the Colorado state legislature asking me for advice on what amendment I would put up on the bill. And my suggestion was to put up an amendment that would exempt people below the poverty level from having to pay the new state tax that they were going to be imposing on each gun that was transferred. With the exception of 2 pro-gun Democrats in the state house, every other Democrat in the state house voted against exempting people below the poverty level from having to pay that tax. I mean, how many taxes can you think of where Democrats will fight tooth and nail against exempting people below the poverty level from having to pay them? And this is just part of the cost. I mean, There are other issues with regard to universal background checks in terms of false positives and other things that we could talk about that I think differentially harm minorities.
Yeah, you've talked about you've written about that over at crimeresearch.org also, and $500 for if you wanted to purchase, have to run a background check 4 separate times. That's insane, and that's a lot of money for lower income or even lower middle class income individuals, and it's only going to affect those who are law-abiding lower income Americans, because there's no way that I can be or you can be or anyone of any sort of story of gangbangers that are going to go and actually go by this law, and they're going to be deterred from committing crime because of the cost of performing a background check like this. And it's always in these areas that propose these incredibly draconian and punitive towards law-abiding people laws that you have really a homicide due to illegally possessed and illegally used firearms at its highest.
Right. I mean, look, you can compare states like Illinois and Indiana right next to each other. Illinois costs about $450 to go through the process to get a concealed carry permit. In neighboring Indiana, which is a Republican state, it costs $47. Actually, the governor there just recently signed a bill lowering it to $0. When in Texas was recently recently lowered the fee for permits few years ago from $140 down to $40. Only about a third of Democrats consistently supported lowering the fee. Republicans were unanimous in terms of lowering the fee. You saw a big increase in the number of permits afterwards, but the biggest increases were in heavily minority areas. It's not too surprising that when you lowered the cost, you particularly made it more attractive for relatively poor people, poor minorities, to be able to go and get concealed handguns. So the question is, why would Democrats there in Texas fight against lowering the fee from $140 down to $40?
I'm shocked that this hasn't been challenged on the constitutional merits of this, because you gave the example of voting rights, and people are trying to argue against having to produce any sort of identification when going to vote, or having to pay to go and get identification to go to vote. They're saying you're being charged to exercise your right. But this actually is in the Bill of Rights. This is a natural right.
Right.
It just amazes me that they don't actually make that same argument on this.
Well, there are actually some Supreme Court cases that are very close on point with regard to the First Amendment. So, for example, you go back to the 1930s or so, the Supreme Court would say that if you put an even 1 penny tax on newspapers, just on newspapers, you put a sales tax on everything, but if you specifically singled out newspapers, courts would strike that down in a second, even a penny, let alone the types of costs that we're talking about here. There's one case from the Marianas Islands, which is a U.S. protectorate, where they tried to charge a $1,000 fee for people being able to go and own a gun. And that was struck down by the district court there. So, I think there's a strong argument to be made. In New Jersey, we just mentioned the governor wants $100 for a firearms ID, $50 for each time you get a permit to own a gun. Mm-hmm. He wants $400 for a concealed carry license. So to be able to go and get a concealed carry, to be able to carry a gun legally, one gun, it's going to cost about $550. You begin to think those are some cases that could really make some strong arguments, I think, before the courts.
Mm. Yeah, John Lott with Crime Prevention Research Center, crimeresearch.org. John, always good to see you. Thank you.
Great talking to you, Dana.